There is a room you have been living in your entire life. You have never left it. You have never even seen its walls. And the strangest part is that everything you believe is real. Every object, every color, every face you recognize, every moment you call the present, is happening inside that room. Kant had a name for it. He called it your mind. And if you think that sounds poetic and harmless, you have not understood it yet. Most people assume the mind is a receiver, something that picks up signals from the outside world and translates them into experience. The eye catches light, the ear catches sound, the brain processes the data, and at the end of that chain, there is reality, something solid, external, waiting to be perceived, neutral, objective, available to anyone willing to look carefully enough. That assumption is so deeply embedded in the way people think and speak that questioning it feels almost absurd. When someone says, "Look at the facts," they mean, look at the world as it actually is, not as you imagine it to be. When someone says, "Be objective," they mean, step outside your personal distortions and see the thing clearly. The entire architecture of modern rationality depends on the idea that reality is out there, and the mind is in here, and the relationship between them is basically one of reception. Kant destroyed that picture. Quietly, methodically, with the kind of patience that only someone who has spent years inside a problem can manage. He published his argument in 1781 in a book called The Critique of Pure Reason. It took him 11 years to write. It is famously difficult to read. Kant's sentences have the structural properties of cathedral architecture, which is to say they are impressive, load-bearing, and extremely uncomfortable to spend time inside. And the central claim is so radical that most people who encounter it find ways to misunderstand it immediately, because understanding it correctly requires giving up something most people are not willing to give up. The belief that you are seeing the world as it actually is. That is the first open loop, because the question is not whether you are mistaken about details. You are probably wrong about plenty of details. Everyone is. The question Kant is asking is something deeper, something that does not go away when you correct your mistakes, something structural, built into the process of perceiving at all, and we will come back to it. There is also a second thing this argument changes, something more personal than epistemology, and we will get to that too. But first, think about the room. You were not born knowing what a tree is. You were not born knowing what distance means, or how to judge whether an object is close or far. You were not born knowing that events happen in sequence, one after another, ordered in time. You learned these things. You constructed frameworks for interpreting experience, frameworks built from thousands of small interactions, corrections, and repetitions. And at some point, those frameworks became invisible. They stopped feeling like interpretations and started feeling like the world itself. The map stopped looking like a map and started looking like the territory. Kant's argument is that some of those frameworks are not learned at all. They are not cultural. They are not personal. They cannot be unlearned because they were never installed in the first place. They are prior to any installation. They are built into the architecture of human cognition before any experience begins. Time, space, causality. These are not things you discover about the world. They are structures your mind imposes on experience before you can perceive anything at all. You do not find time in the world. You bring time to the world. And without that imposition, without the mind organizing raw sensation into sequences and durations, experience would not be possible. There would be no perception, just noise. Let that settle. If you are still listening at this point, you are probably the kind of person who finds it interesting when ideas get genuinely uncomfortable. The kind of person who prefers a question that breaks something over an answer that reassures you. Go ahead and subscribe, because this channel is exactly that kind of conversation every time. Now, back to the room. Kant had a word for the world as it actually is, independent of any mind perceiving it. He called it the Ding an sich, the thing in itself, the object as it exists before your cognition gets involved, before your categories organize it, before your perception filters it, before your mind applies the frameworks of space and time and cause and effect that make experience coherent. The raw, unmediated reality underneath everything you think you are seeing. and his position on that thing in itself was unambiguous. You cannot know it, not because it is hidden somewhere difficult to reach, not because your instruments are too crude, and science will eventually develop better ones, not because someone is concealing it from you, but because the moment you perceive anything at all, your mind has already transformed it. The act of knowing something is also the act of shaping it. There is no way to step outside your own cognition and compare your experience to reality directly. The comparison is always made from inside the room. There is no door. This is where people start getting uncomfortable and start looking for exits. The first exit most people try is the scientific one. They say, "But science gives us real knowledge. We can measure things with precision. We can predict outcomes with extraordinary accuracy. Physics describes the behavior of the universe correctly. We know this because the predictions work. If we were all just living inside our own cognitive constructions, none of that would be possible. Science would not work. Bridges would fall. Satellites would miss their targets." Kant's answer is elegant and slightly brutal, and it is the move that separates him from every skeptic who came before him. Science works precisely because human minds all share the same cognitive architecture. Time, space, causality, these are not personal distortions. They are not individual quirks that happen to align. They are universal structures, hardwired into the conditions of human experience. Every human being who has ever lived has organized experience through the same fundamental categories. That is why scientific knowledge is reliable, communicable, and reproducible across cultures and centuries. Not because we are accessing reality directly, but because we are all inside the same room. Think about that for a moment. The reason science works is not evidence against Kant. According to Kant, it is evidence for him. The second exit people try is the common sense one. They say, "I see a chair, the chair is there, I can sit in it and it holds my weight. How is that not real?" And the answer is, it is real. Kant is not saying objects are illusions. He is not a solipsist. He is saying that what you are perceiving when you see that chair, the shape, the color, the hardness, the position in space, the way it persists through time, all of that is already organized and filtered through cognitive frameworks that belong to you, not to the chair. The chair in itself, whatever it actually is before your mind gets involved, that remains unknown. And here is the piece that does not go away when you accept this. The same is true for other people. When you look at another human being, you are not perceiving them directly. You are perceiving your mind's rendering of them, organized by the same categories, structured by the same frameworks, shaped by everything you have already learned about how people work and what their expressions mean and what their behavior implies. Which means every relationship you have ever had, every moment of genuine connection, every time you felt certain you truly understood another person, was always, at least partially, a construction. You were two constructions meeting, organized by the same cognitive architecture, which is why understanding was sometimes possible, but never complete. That is not cynicism, that is architecture. Now we need to talk about Kant himself, because the philosophy makes more sense when you understand the person who built it. Immanuel Kant was born in 1724 in Königsberg, Prussia, a city he never left, not once. His entire life occurred within roughly a few kilometers of where he was born. He woke at the same time every morning. He took the same walk every afternoon at the same hour, along the same route. His neighbors reportedly set their clocks by his appearance on the street. Not metaphorically, actually. He never married. He was sociable, but not intimate. Disciplined, but not cold. From the outside, this looks like the biography of someone who solved the problem of the external world by simply refusing to engage with it. A man who claimed the world was unknowable because he had already decided not to look. That reading is wrong, and it misses everything important. Kant's discipline was not avoidance, it was method. Serious thinking requires specific conditions, and those conditions do not sustain themselves. Distraction is the default. Drift is the default. The routine was not a sign that Kant feared the world. It was a sign that he had diagnosed exactly what the world does to the mind when you let it, and he had decided not to let it. The infrastructure was designed to protect the work. Before the great philosophical turn, he was a fairly conventional academic, He taught courses on geography, mathematics, physics. He wrote about earthquakes. He was considered a competent, unremarkable professor at a provincial university. Nothing in his early career suggested what was coming. But there is one thing you need to know about what happened next, and it is stranger than most people realize. The book that changed everything was not written because Kant had a great idea. It was written because a Scottish philosopher had destroyed one, and Kant could not live with the wreckage. And then he read Hume. David Hume, Scottish philosopher, empiricist, brilliant and slightly dangerous, had argued that causality is not something we observe in the world. When you see one billiard ball strike another and watch the second one move, you do not actually see the causal connection. You see sequence. You see one event followed by another, and through habit and repetition, you build the expectation that the first caused the second. But the causal link itself, you never perceive it. You infer it. You project it. It is a habit of the mind, not a feature of reality. Kant said this woke him from his dogmatic slumber, which is one of the more entertaining things a philosopher has ever admitted in print. Most philosophers claim to have been solving problems. Kant admitted he had been asleep, because Hume's argument carried a catastrophic implication. If causality is just a mental habit, if it is not actually in the world, then the foundation of scientific knowledge collapses. We cannot say that events cause other events. We can only say that events follow other events. And science built on that foundation is not knowledge of how things work. It is sophisticated expectation. Kant could not accept that conclusion. The success of Newtonian physics was not up for debate. The knowledge was real. The question was how to account for it. And he could not refute Hume on Hume's own terms, because on Hume's own terms Hume was right. So he did something more radical than refutation. He reframed the entire question. He asked, what if causality is not something we observe in the world and then project? What if causality is a structure the mind brings to experience before any observation is possible? What if without causality, without the cognitive framework that organizes events into causes and effects, we could not perceive the world at all? In that case, it is not that causality is uncertain. It is that causality is a precondition of experience, part of the room. And suddenly Hume's problem is dissolved, not by proving that causality exists in the external world, but by showing that the question is the wrong question. The right question is, what must the mind contribute before experience begins, in order for experience to be possible at all? Kant called this his Copernican revolution. Copernicus had proposed that the Earth moved around the Sun, inverting the relationship between observer and observed. Kant proposed the same inversion in epistemology. Instead of asking what the world is like, ask what the mind must be like for the world to appear as it does. The observer does not orbit reality. Reality, as we perceive it, orbits the observer. And here is where it gets personal, because if the mind is not receiving the world but building it, the question is no longer just philosophical. The question becomes, what else have you been constructing without knowing it? Consider what it means for the way you experience time. You do not experience time the way a physicist describes it, as a dimension, neutral and indifferent. You experience time as a direction, as a story, past behind you settled and heavy, future ahead uncertain, present as the only point that feels real, though it is always already slipping away before you can hold it. That structure, that narrative shape, is not in the world. It is not in the clock. It is not in the physics. It is in you. The clock measures intervals. You create meaning. Without your cognitive architecture, there is no story. There is only duration. Now, here is the personal part. The part I mentioned at the beginning that is harder than epistemology. Think of someone you were absolutely certain you knew, not someone you had just met. Someone you had watched for years, watched how they behaved under pressure, how they treated people when no one was looking, what they reached for when things got difficult. You had a model. You had data. You were not guessing. And then something happened that the model could not explain. Not a small error, a structural failure. The person did something, or you discovered something, that meant the version of them you had been carrying was wrong at a level that adjustment could not fix. Most people experience that as a betrayal. Kant would call it something more precise, a collision between a construction and a reality that was never obligated to match it. You were never perceiving that person directly. You were perceiving your mind's rendering of them, organized by your categories, filtered by your prior experience, shaped by what you needed them to be as much as by what they actually were. The failure was not personal, it was structural. It is what happens when a mind built on constructions encounters reality, declining to cooperate. That does not make it less painful, but it makes it legible. And there is something clarifying about legibility, about understanding the machinery rather than just experiencing the crash. Memory does not record events. You know this in the way you know things that have not fully landed yet. Memory reconstructs. Every time you remember something, you are not retrieving a stored file. You are rebuilding the experience from fragments, filling gaps, adjusting details to fit the narrative you have developed about yourself and your life. The reconstruction feels like retrieval. It is not. Which means the version of your past that feels most certain, the story of why things happened, who was responsible, why you became who you are, is a construction too. Organized by categories, shaped by the frameworks you were using at the moment of reconstruction, not necessarily at the moment of the original event. Think about what that means. The argument you are certain you won, the conversation you replay at night and still feel wronged by, the version of yourself 10 years ago that you judge from the position of who you are now. All of it rebuilt, all of it organized by a mind that was not trying to distort, just trying to make coherent sense of raw material that never came with instructions. Kant described the philosophical architecture of this with a precision that makes most contemporary neuroscience look like confirmation rather than discovery. The mind does not passively receive, it actively constructs. From the most basic perceptual data to the most complex autobiographical narrative, the contribution of the mind is prior, structural, and inescapable. Here is what Kant was not saying. He was not saying that knowledge is impossible. He was not saying that all perspectives are equally valid, or that careful reasoning and sloppy assumption are the same thing. He was too precise for any of that. What he was saying is that the kind of knowledge available to human minds has a specific shape and specific limits, and that those limits are not failures. They are the conditions under which knowledge is possible at all. The room is not a defect. It is the only place where experience can happen. But it helps, enormously, to know you are in it. Because the errors that cause the most damage in human life are almost always errors of this kind. The person who mistakes their interpretation of events for the events themselves. The person who treats their model of another human being as a transparent window onto that person's reality. The person whose certainty has closed down the possibility of reconsidering what they think they know. These are not rare pathologies. They are the ordinary condition of minds that have never been introduced to the problem Kant spent his life formulating. Kant kept walking his route through Königsberg every afternoon. The same streets, the same schedule. And he kept thinking, with more precision and more structural rigor than almost anyone who has attempted it before or since, about the conditions under which anything can be known at all. He died in 1804 at the age of 79. He had spent more than half a century in the same city, inside the same disciplined schedule. He had never seen the ocean. He had never stood at the edge of something vast and felt the physical sensation of limits. He had found the limit a different way, not by traveling to the edge of the world, but by asking, with enough patience and enough willingness to follow an idea wherever it actually led, what happens at the edge of the mind? If this kind of thinking, the kind that does not comfort but does clarify, is what you came here for, the next video continues in this direction. Watch it. And if you want to mark where you left off with this question, leave a comment. It keeps the conversation alive. What you have just encountered is not a philosophical curiosity. It is a structural tool, a way of looking at every claim to certainty you will ever encounter, starting with your own, and asking, what is this actually made of? What is the construction here? Where are the walls? The room you have been living in your entire life has no exit, but it does have a window. Knowing you are inside it, that is the window. The question is not whether the world is real. The question is who built the world you are perceiving. And the answer, Every time, without exception, is the same. You did.